Africa is home to 1.5 billion people, but still lacks representation at the United Nations Security Council. How can that be changed? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. When the United Nations was created in 1945, most of today's African countries were still under colonial rule and had no voice in international affairs. After almost 80 years, the continent is still lacking permanent representation at the United Nations Security Council. We will discuss how that can change later in the show, but first I spoke with the Mali Foreign Minister, Abdoulaye Diop, about the new face of the African continent, and I started by asking him about Mali's relations with China.
The relationship with China is strong and is growing every day. At the last FOCAC meeting and after the meeting between President Xi Jinping and the President Goita of Mali, the two parties have decided to take the partnership at the level of strategic relationship between China and Mali. We think that will open more opportunity for both political engagement with between the two countries, but also mutual support. But more importantly, to look at the economic opportunity and possibilities between China and Mali for more investment, but to respond to the needs of Mali government for the transformation of our economy. So I see a lot of opportunity for increased cooperation and economic partnership between China and Mali.
So insofar as economic expansion is concerned, where do you see the most potential? Which sectors do you see growing?
There are many. Education sector is very important. We know that China has invested also a lot in Mali. One of the major university, which is the Carvalho University, that have been built with the support of China, is one of the largest in the West African region. Besides that, health will continue to be a significant area of engagement, but also building infrastructure for health. Mining sector is a growing sector and very important one because, as you know, Mali has significant deposit and potential in terms of natural and mineral resources, specifically lithium, gold, and all these strategic minerals that the world economy need today to continue to grow. We think that beside that, agro-processing is a very important area. Cotton, for instance, Mali is the largest producer of cotton. We want to see it more transformed to look at the whole chain from the production to the textile industry. We have even requested China to help us with some of these units in Mali for the textile production. We want to look at the other area of the agricultural transformation. In all these areas, Mali's interest is to ask China first to use this resource and expertise to help us grow and develop using the transfer of technology, but to helping also to build the local capacity in the spirit of win-win collaboration. Definitely Mali want to move from just exporting raw material and to see more transformation, more value added to Malian economy to create local jobs. Of course, infrastructure also remain one of the key areas in which Chinese are involved in building infrastructures. Power plant energy is today a critical element. We are in partnership with China, for instance, to build a solar energy plant, which has been launched just a few months ago. So we have quite a number of areas in which I think there is a strong commitment from both sides to work into concretizing different projects in this area. The coming months will be quite critical in transforming these projects into to benefit two countries.
And Minister, what about cooperation in the technology sector? And of course, as we all are aware, technology is moving at such a rapid rate right now, and the world is moving more and more into digital economies. How do you see that cooperation to make sure that there is no sort of digital gap between developed countries and developing countries like yours?
Yes, definitely. I think I missed that point. Technology is definitely one of the key areas. As you may have seen it during the visit of President Goita in China, he visited the headquarters of Huawei in Beijing, because Huawei has been quite involved in Mali in building IT technologies, are also involved in providing digital support to the security sector as well. Recently, the President of Mali have launched an ambitious program for digitalization of the overall administration and the financial and social services. And Huawei have been called on to help us to design this project, and we think that going forward, of course, digital will remain one of the key components. I think Exim Bank is already providing support to Mali through Huawei for the project called Mali Digital, which helped to build, to put in place video surveillance for the security, but also putting in place the whole IT infrastructure, working with Malian public company and private company, but we want to make sure that we are also putting in place a national data center. All these are elements which are critical in our endeavor, but definitely you are correct, digital remain and should continue to be a stronger element of this collaboration to help us to jump some critical step toward the development of Mali.
Minister, in recent years, Mali has asserted its independence, especially when it comes to foreign policy and security policy as well. I mean, in 2022, you asked the French to leave the country. That ended a 9-year operation. So what is your assessment of this changing situation in that part of West Africa and the security situation, especially in northern Mali?
You know, the new authorities of Mali has put in place a new paradigm, which is based on the fact that the development of our country should first be on the shoulder of Malian to take responsibility of their country, both in terms of security, but also in terms of development. That we should be at the center, and that we need to develop our own vision, which we have done. But in doing so, we want also to look at our relationship with external partners and our neighbors differently. Every effort should take into account the sovereignty of Mali. It's been that Mali have the responsibility to devise policies and programs for Malians, and that we need also the others to respect our choice of partners. It's up to Mali to decide who should be partner of Mali, and not to any external force or former colonial masters to tell us who should be the partner or the friend of Mali. Today, Mali highest authorities, President Goita and others, we have decided that we are moving into diversifying our partnership, looking at Turkey, at China, at the BRICS, and Russia and others. Or any partner who is willing to come in to support, but in respecting that vision that we want things to be done differently. We want to have the benefits of our people at the center of whatever we do. We think that our political choices should be respected. It will be up to Malian to decide which system of governance they want to have in place, which take into account our history, our tradition, but also the needs of our country. This is our new vision that we are carrying, in that we want every partner who is coming to respect that one. And we appreciate that China shares our views on this issue, on human rights and other issues. I think it's very important that we have this partnership, and this respectful partnership and common understanding with China as a backdrop for any economic engagement between China, Mali, and China in Africa.
Minister, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
To continue our discussion about the challenges facing the African continent, let's bring in our panel. From Kampala in Uganda, Joseph Ochieno is a writer and commentator on African affairs. From Johannesburg, Emmanuel Matambo is Research Director at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. And Gustavo de Carvalho is an international relations analyst. He joins us from Pretoria, also in South Africa. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Joseph, let me start with you, and let's look at some of the challenges that the countries on the African continent face. One of them, of course, is demographic. Africa, in 2030, its young population will make up 42% of world youth and 60% of the population on the African continent. Of course, this presents both opportunities for the countries of Africa, but it also presents challenges. And I'm wondering, when we look at Africa's current economic trajectory, will it be able to meet those challenges by 2030, especially with this young population coming onto the job market?
Thanks for having me, Adnan. And it's interesting, you're right, that really the size of the population as it grows, and the size particularly of the youth population as it is, should really be a net benefit to the continent. We saw how our continent and other countries, say, for example, China, did make the best use of its population size. On the continent, by and large, it should be able to do so. But really, if you look at where we've been in the last, say, 20 to 30 years, I'm not quite sure that with a population growth of 1.5% and then fairly decent economic growth in the last 20 or so years, if you look at the figures only, it should have meant that Africa is in a far better position today to deal with the obvious challenges of actually young population, unemployment, and then investments in areas like infrastructure and public services generally, which has really been substantially failed the weight. It hasn't. Will it do so in the future? I am optimistic. It's actually possible. We are having this debate. This conversation was hardly anywhere, on the global spaces 20 years ago. So it's possible that there's no reason why we don't look in that way positively. These days, as I said, African leaders make regular trips to China, including last month when China hosted the Africa Summit. This continues. African leaders and indeed African students and indeed African technocrats have no reason why they don't learn from big successful stories like China, and so therefore seek to urgently implement this. But side by side with that, regardless of that, we are coming from, if you like, a major infrastructure deficit of nearly $100 billion US dollars every year. China is supporting that process, but it's not enough.
Right.
At the same time, there is this big rise and a projection of a huge migration towards urban centers where young people predominantly looking for jobs. We do not have the capacity at the moment to create those opportunities. So it comes with huge challenges going forward.
Right. I want to get back to that issue of sustainable investment in a moment. But I want to get to Gustavo right now. Gustavo, great to have you with us on the show. There is another challenge for the countries of Africa, and that is if we look at development across the world right now, it's changing. A lot of it has to do with the advanced technologies we see right now, the transition to digital economies. And I'm wondering, to what extent do the countries of Africa risk becoming victim to what's known as the digital gap? That the fact that they could fall behind as these technologies advance at such a rapid rate. I mean, how do these countries meet that challenge?
There is certainly a great challenge that African countries face around that, especially when we consider that majority of the African population does not have access to the internet. We have been seeing in a number of countries a rapid digitalization of processes. We've seen in regions like in East Africa, particularly when it comes to digital forms of trading and to engaging with the economy, that can, yes, indeed can be seen as a major challenge for the continent, but it also provides a number of opportunities for many African countries to be able to leapfrog some of those deficiencies that we have in terms of our economies and in terms of our integration in the global economy. But I think it's also important to look into continental processes that are happening at the moment, particularly when it comes to regional integration, and particularly when it comes to the initial stages of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And that is seen as an opportunity to provide a space in which African countries can trade more with one another, that can increase the complementarity, and by that fostering ways in which the economies can not only diversify in terms of the products that they are producing and exporting, but also to identify new ways in which that complementarity can provide means for also providing further investments in terms of infrastructure for digital inclusion within the continent, but also in terms of better inserting the continents within global value chains.
Emmanuel, great to have you with us as well. I mean, we've seen a new synergy develop over the past few years between African nations and China in this sort of post-colonial era. China is now the continent's biggest trading partner and a significant source of investment. But there are also concerns that need to be addressed. And one of those concerns, which was made by the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, is that Africa, there's an imbalance in the trade with China, that Africa imports far more than it exports to China. So looking at that, how do you see this relationship economically and in terms of trade develop in the future?
Yeah, yes, indeed. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and good day to your viewers. Yes, it was quite refreshing to hear President Cyril Ramaphosa be so frank about the trade deficit that Africa runs in its trade with China. But there's a lot of potential in this particular trade, because extending from the time of the global recession in 2008, when some Western countries were withdrawing their investments from Africa, especially in countries that are dependent on mineral resources, such as Zambia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and other countries where there was a withdrawal, so to say, of Western investment in those particular countries. China proved to be a player that was more reliable than its Western counterparts. So Africa, though, has to make sure that they build on that. I think over the past, we were kind of tiptoeing around our relationship with China. But for South Africa to speak so frankly, it also shows not only that Africa is realizing that it is running a trade deficit, but that its relationship with China has matured to a certain level where there is now a general comfort in each other's presence, where you can actually state what the blemishes are in this potentially beneficial relationship.
Joseph Ochieno, we are looking at the world right now, and it is rapidly changing. I mean, it's now very much a multipolar world that we are living in. And one of the points that I made to the foreign minister of Mali in my conversation with him was that Mali, for instance, has asserted its independence when it comes to security policies, when it comes to foreign policies as well. I mean, if we remember in 2022, Mali asked French troops to leave the country after 9 years. And we look at Niger, for instance. Niger asked the United States to close its bases there and move its troops out. Are we seeing some kind of a new paradigm in Africa right now, with countries becoming more assertive, more independent, and really taking responsibility for their own security and economic interests?
Absolutely, and in a way, some of these are actually credit to China, meaning China coming into the play and linked to the observation being made by your earlier guest in terms of China being able to fill in the gaps. But beyond that, I think African leaders have woken up in more recent times to realize that actually it's absolutely in their own interests to not only assert their positions, they assert their positions as far as their own strategic, national, indeed continental interests are concerned, but that, yes, the reality is that in many cases, particularly in the countries that you refer, they were being excessively, massively exploited.
Emmanuel, let me come back to you. The Reuters news agency reported recently that the Sahel region faces huge security challenges as insurgent groups in this particular part of Africa continue to destabilize the region. What can you tell us about the security situation there, and what kinds of efforts are being made to counter that?
Well, the security situation in the Sahel region remains volatile as it has been. And by the way, let us first of all look at the long-term effects of what has been happening because there is a subtext to what is happening whenever people talk about the Sahel region today, and that subtext is the return of military juntas in power. Now, what caused that? I think first, at the time when Africa was liberalizing its political system, pandering to liberal democracy, I think there was a belief, so to say, that this move from military juntas, from one-party systems to multi-party politics would also ignite economic growth, would also ignite good governance in Africa. But we have seen that that was really a forced dawn, as a lot of people who were democratically elected went on to change constitutions and extend their time in power. On top of that, rather than just foisting themselves on unwilling citizens, they also could not provide security for those people. So there was this forced narrative by African people to say, maybe if we put people who are trained in the military, then we might secure ourselves against extremist violence, so to say. So that is why we saw that when when there were these constitutional seizures of power, they were actually supported by ordinary people in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso as well, because people thought, okay, here we have a chance. The civilian governments could not provide security for us. But obviously we have seen that, yes, the security insurgency there has kind of continued. The efforts that are being made, especially on the part of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, that now they have the Sahel alliance, through which they hope they could have a concerted fight against terrorism and insurgency. But obviously the jury is still out on that one.
Gustavo, on the question of global governance, and there's been a lot of debate recently over reform of the United Nations, especially reform in the Security Council, its composition and the powers that it wields. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, he's been talking about this. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
We cannot accept that the world's preeminent peace and security body lacks a permanent voice for a continent of well over 1 billion people, a young and rapidly growing population, making up 28% of the membership of the United Nations. Nor can we accept that Africa's views are undervalued on questions of peace and security, both on the continent and around the world.
So, Gustavo, what are the prospects for meaningful reform at the United Nations and the Security Council, especially looking at Africa's request that it would like to have 2 permanent seats on the Security Council?
I think we live in a very interesting moment, because despite a space where globally the legitimacy of the United Nations has been tested and has decayed considerably, considering its paralysis. If we look into the statements that member states made during the General Assembly last week, many member states, and particularly African member states, reflected the fact that the United Nations is undemocratic, it lacks transparency, and it lacks legitimacy. Certainly with signing of the Pact of the Future that was signed by most of the United Nations members last week, there's direct reference on the importance of African countries to join the UN Security Council. Last time we saw a serious discussion around Security Council reform that occurred in 2005 and 2006, meaning that it's almost 20 years. And for African countries, this is an important matter. When we consider that over 60% of resolutions that are approved by the United Nations Security Council are related to Africa, this deficit of participation, voice, and agency of African members, it is something that has to be addressed. And increasingly, we see many countries around the world providing such support. Of course, we still need many questions to be asked in terms of what is the likelihood of permanent members of the Security Council to indeed engage in such discussions and to enable such changes within the Security Council to occur. There is also a very contentious debate regarding a potential joining of 2 new African members to the Security Council, but taking away the idea of veto, which what some within the continent say that it's almost like inviting African countries for dinner, but they are not allowed to eat. And when considering that so many of the attention that the Security Council places within Africa is of critical importance. But there is another challenge within that we need to identify, that is who would be amongst the 55 African countries that are members of the United Nations that would effectively be part of this potentially reformed Security Council. I think that this will still take quite some time in terms of negotiations and debates, but it's important that the momentum is kept and options and choices and ideas are presented, so to continue a discussion and to convince particularly the permanent members of the council.
Right. Emmanuel, what are your views on this? I mean, how do you see the prospects for reform at the United Nations, particularly expanding African representation on the Security Council?
Yes, indeed. I would just add to what Gustavo has said. I mean, there is really consensus, properly put it, that Africa would like to have two members on the Security Council. I was very disappointed by the United States stance of saying, well, we can support the admission of two African members, but without veto powers. I mean, that is such a patronizing gimmick, and this is the United States shooting itself in the foot and forfeiting the goodwill that it might actually enjoy from the African continent. Having said that, this will be a more challenging task for Africa itself, even if we were to be given the mandate to have two representatives at the Security Council, because this is different from the G20, wherein the African Union was invited as a member. The negotiations that go on at the G20 are less as contentious as it would be if Africa were to be invited to the United Nations Security Council, because even if we were to say we join as the African Union, that might be very difficult at a practical level, because then how do you drive the consensus of Africa, of 55 African countries with different interests, with different identities, and with different levels of security challenges as well? So that might be very difficult. Amongst the African members themselves, obviously there has been this subliminal fight, so to say, between South Africa and Nigeria. But even that fight is becoming obsolete, because it was mostly based on the economic status of the two countries. But obviously, if you have to apply for membership of the United Nations Security Council, you also have to look at your security status. You also have to look at things such as technology and the production of energy. And that actually increases the number of candidates that might vie for that permanent seat. So it's a very difficult task for us.
Right. Joseph, just one final point I want to get to, and we've just got a little bit of time left, but you talked about finance at the beginning of our conversation. Well, at the recent China-Africa Forum, which took place in Beijing, there was a big focus on future Chinese investments in Africa. China pledged $51 billion, and this would be part of loans, aid, and investment to the African continent. How important is this to meet that shortfall that you were talking about?
I think it's extremely important, but I am not sure about how the detail of that spreads across the continent. So although we are looking at it as Africa as a continent, there are several countries, and some of these are generally quite generally bilateral, but possibly it links to the conversation we're having about the question of the UN General Assembly, UN slot for Africa, and how basically the discussions do take place, and which aspect of that do you link to a particular nation state. Generally, anyway, this continent still needs a huge amount of investment, but also we have hard cases where governments have substantially overspent themselves, and part of the campaigns on the continent, particularly from civil society organizations, and in fact the youth population, is that governments need to be able to be leaner. And you see some of the things that happened in Kenya, where there is the belief that possibly the political elite have sort of overspent and overshot themselves. So there is a need for general prudence across the continent, and there's a need for general review of how our economies run and managed, and so therefore how opportunities that come from China and countries like that are able to be nurtured in such a manner that, well, they become beneficial, so that we're able to push really this continent into the next direction.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.